June 24th, 1941. A dusty crossroad under a leaden sky, 3 miles east of Reshape, Lithuania. You're standing on the muddy verge beside a battered Panzer III, the engine still warm. The air smells of diesel and cordite. Somewhere down the road, a delayed Luftwaffe engine coughs. A distant bird of prey circling over a column of wrecked trucks. Captain Karl-Heinz Müller, thin-faced, map case slung across his chest, iron cross already tarnished from weeks on the road, squints through smoke glass at a low ridge where morning haze outlines hulking shapes. At first he thinks they are agricultural tractors hauled out on the road. Then the shapes move with an ungainly, deliberate grace, and a new sound worms its way through the morning. A low, throaty diesel that is neither German nor anything he's heard in Spain or France. When the nearest machine crests the rise, it is not merely a tank. It is a different language of metal. Sloped faceplates catch the weak sun and throw it into a sheet of gray. Wide tracks chew through the earth as if the vehicle were eating the road itself. A gun, long, straight, precise, turns. Men around Müller freeze. The tank silhouette is compact, impossible to ignore. The T-34.by the second dawn of the invasion, German patrols had already begun whispering that their maps had missed something vast. Intelligence briefings had told them to expect obsolete light tanks, disintegrating BTs and T-26s, an opponent to be outmaneuvered and outgunned. What the reconnaissance reports now show are not a few isolated prototypes, but concentrations. Medium tanks with diesel hearts and sloped armor, punching German 37mm rounds like wet paper. The first formal encounter, the KV and T-34 clusters that stalled entire spearheads near Reshape, is not an isolated tale, but the first audible note of a chorus Germany had not been trained to hear. The immediate tactical shock is electric. Müller watches his radio operator fumble for frequencies that will get word back to battalion. The standard anti-tank weapon in his formation, the 3.7 centimeters PaK-36, has a ballistic profile and penetration that worked in Poland and France. Against this new silhouette, at anything but point-blank range, it is a toy. Officers on the ridge start barking orders to immobilize. Aim for tracks, jam fuel lines, close until the 50mm and 75mm German guns can be brought in. But the T-34s keep coming in numbers and with a mobility that mocks expectation. The Germans try everything. Field artillery, aircraft strafing, AA guns and an anti-tank roll. Even explosives and grenades shoved into hatches. Some Soviet tanks are knocked out. Many keep going until they run out of ammunition or are isolated and captured. A few, like the KV that blocked a German bridgehead for a day, are engineered stubbornness incarnate. But the deeper shock follows when the radio messages and prisoner interrogations are pulled back in the rear. German intelligence, OKH's carefully stacked estimates, had written Soviet industry off as backward, incapable of mass-producing modern armored vehicles at scale. That assumption had been a structural error, a pillar that would crack. Reports from manufacture and logistics sections, from intercepted train movements and capture technicians, start to paint a very different picture. Factories uprooted and reassembled beyond the Urals, assembly lines welded into railway sidings, an economy rerouted into steel, engines, and gears with an almost industrial fanaticism. The scale of it does not yet have a tidy number, but the rumor mill, the quickest amplifier in any army, begins to whisper a figure that will travel like a ghost through German staff rooms. Tens of thousands of tanks. The idea itself feels obscene to officers whose pre-war planning assumed a Soviet armored corps to be expendable and finite. Müller remembers the briefing where maps showed the Soviet western districts as thin skirts of force. Now, sitting on a churned embankment with half a dozen sergeants, he reads a new kind of map, the map of production. Names like Kharkiv, Stalingrad, Gorky, and Chelyabinsk, once peripheral dots, begin to mean lines of assembly and furnaces, the private addresses of monstrous output. A company captain in Signaler's kit recites a boorish number he'd heard from an interrogated factory foreman. 50,000 tanks, the man insisted, voice flat as a ledger. The number lands in the mess hall and doesn't leave. For officers schooled in blitzkrieg arithmetic, divisions measured in hundreds, not tens of thousands. The notion that the enemy might not be exhausted but replaced, that steel and diesel might be summoned in quantities that dwarf current attrition, is not only militarily dangerous, it is psychologically corrosive. That disbelief has consequences on the front. Tactically, when a single T-34 or KV-1 appears, German crews expend time finding ways around it. Strategically, when the staff in Königsberg and Berlin shrug off early reports as the panicked exaggerations of retreat, the result is a policy error. The German response, to improvise heavier guns, to deploy the 8.8 centimeters flak in an anti-tank role, and to accelerate designs like the Panther and Tiger, is born of this shock. In the mud and dust at the eastern edge of the map, officers like Muller begin to understand that they are not simply fighting machines, but the weight of a hidden industrial will that the German general staff had systematically underestimated. As noon slides into the gray of another midsummer evening, the German column withdraws, tracks clanking and men silent. Muller can still hear that diesel growl in his head, not only the sound of a machine, but, suddenly, the sound of a decision. To assume the Soviet rear was empty would be to misread the war. Soldiers will tell new stories in back rooms and dugouts about the tanks that looked like they had been grown from iron rather than built, and the name T-34 will begin to travel like an omen along the supply lines. October 1941. Deep inside the Ural Mountains, the air trembles with the hum of machinery. The night outside is endless black, snow falls in wide, silent sheets. But inside the factory at Chelyabinsk, later known as Tankograd, the world glows red with molten steel. Sparks fall like fireflies over sweating men and women in heavy coats. The clang of hammers and the rhythmic thud of hydraulic presses fill the air. It is not an industrial plant. It is an organism, alive, breathing, producing. The war has moved far to the west. Yet here, thousands of kilometers from the front, the real weapon is being forged, not in the barrel of a gun, but in the unending discipline of production. The German generals on the front line had no idea this world existed. They thought the Soviets would collapse under the weight of their own retreat. They were wrong. When Hitler's Operation Barbarossa began, the Soviet Union responded with an act of logistical genius that even now seems impossible: a full industrial exodus. Entire factories from Leningrad, Moscow, and Kharkiv were dismantled, labeled, and loaded onto trains, thousands of them. Machine tools, presses, and conveyor belts. Even the windows and flooring were shipped east. Workers and their families followed, packed into freezing freight cars. Many never reached their destination. Those who did built new factories out of nothing, laying concrete in snowstorms and welding assembly lines beneath open skies. By the time Muller and his men first faced T-34s near Rezhenyi, the Soviet rear had already begun to awaken. Stalin had declared that evacuation is victory. His commissars enforced it with brutal clarity. Production that had taken decades to grow in the West was resurrected beyond the Urals in a matter of months. And at the center of this resurrection stood one machine, the T-34. It was a tank designed not only to fight, but to be built fast. Fewer parts, simplified curves, wide tracks for mud and snow, a diesel engine that drank less fuel and refused to freeze. Every design decision was a conversation between the engineer and the battlefield. When the war demanded thousands, the Soviets listened and answered. In the Chelyabinsk plant, T-34 hulls rolled off lines beside KV heavy tanks, artillery shells, and spare engines. Night shifts ran without pause. Factory managers slept beside the furnaces. Workers wore threadbare gloves, their faces blackened with soot, their hair stiff with frost. Children hauled steel bolts in baskets. Old women welded armor plates by lamplight. It wasn't heroism, it was survival ritualized into labor. The German officers couldn't imagine this. To them, industrial power was clean, efficient, orderly, the rhythm of Krupp, the discipline of Siemens. Soviet industry was supposed to be clumsy, uncoordinated, incapable of sustained output. And yet, through sheer will and centralized command, the USSR achieved a transformation that defied logic. By 1942, as the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the factories beyond the Urals increased their tempo. New rail lines stretched like veins from the mountains to the front. Every week, hundreds of T-34s left the plants on flat cars bound for Moscow, Stalingrad, Leningrad, wherever the Red Army could still hold a line. A German reconnaissance officer near Smolensk wrote in disbelief, "We destroy them, and more appear. Their tanks return as if grown from the ground." What the Germans did not see were the trains arriving day and night from the east, a steel tide. The Soviet command measured success not in territory gained, but in tanks delivered. Production that had taken decades to grow in the West was resurrected beyond the Urals in a matter of months. And at the center of this resurrection stood one machine, the T-34. It was a tank designed not only to fight, but to be built fast. Fewer parts, simplified curves, wide tracks for mud and snow, a diesel engine that drank less fuel and refused to freeze. Every design decision was a conversation between the engineer and the battlefield. When the war demanded thousands, the Soviets listened and answered. In the Chelyabinsk plant, T-34 hulls rolled off lines beside KV-heavy tanks, artillery shells, and spare engines. Night shifts ran without pause. Factory managers slept beside the furnaces. Workers wore threadbare gloves, their faces blackened with soot, their hair stiff with frost. Children hauled steel bolts in baskets. Old women welded armor plates by lamplight. It wasn't heroism, it was survival ritualized into labor. The German officers couldn't imagine this. To them, industrial power was clean, efficient, orderly, the rhythm of Krupp, the discipline of Siemens. Soviet industry was supposed to be clumsy, uncoordinated, incapable of sustained output. And yet, through sheer will and centralized command, the USSR achieved a transformation that defied logic. By 1942, as the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the factories beyond the Urals increased their tempo. New rail lines stretched like veins from the mountains to the front. Every week, hundreds of T-34s left the plants on flat cars bound for Moscow, Stalingrad, Leningrad, wherever the Red Army could still hold a line. A German reconnaissance officer near Smolensk wrote in disbelief, "We destroy them, and more appear. Their tanks return as if grown from the ground." What the Germans did not see were the trains arriving day and night from the east, a steel tide. The Soviet command measured success not in territory gained, but in tanks delivered. At German headquarters in Taganrog, officers gathered around a situation map thick with red arrows. One of them, Major Friedrich Hoth, traced a trembling line with his pencil and muttered, "This can't be right. Intelligence says their production was crippled." Another officer looked up grimly. "Then intelligence is wrong." The reports arriving from the front confirmed it. Soviet armored divisions were attacking simultaneously across hundreds of kilometers, from the Don Bend to Voronezh. Entire regiments of T-34s were striking in waves, forcing German infantry to dig deeper, calling in anti-tank guns that barely scratched the Soviet armor. The balance had shifted. The T-34, once a shocking novelty, had become an overwhelming constant. Each tank bore the same iconic lines, the sloped armor, the low turret, the distinctive engine growl. But now they moved in disciplined formation, supported by new self-propelled guns and infantry with anti-tank rifles. For every German panzer destroyed, 2 more T-34s seemed to appear from the snow. It was as if the earth itself were producing them. Behind this avalanche was the machine Stalin had built in the east, an empire of factories that no bombers could reach. The Chelyabinsk Kirov plant, Nizhny Tagil's Uralvagonzavod, and countless satellite workshops operated around the clock. German officers, who once mocked Soviet inefficiency, now studied reports that read like nightmares. Output increasing despite material shortages. Evacuation complete, production unaffected. T-34 design simplified for mass manufacture. Even as Germany's own industry struggled to meet the demands of a two-front war, the Soviets were perfecting industrial warfare, the ability to lose without collapsing, to rebuild faster than destruction could matter. At the front, Captain Muller saw this transformation with his own eyes. His Panzer unit, once the spearhead of unstoppable offensives, was now a defensive fire brigade. Racing from one threatened sector to another, outnumbered, outgunned, outlasted. The snow hid the movement of Soviet armor until it was too late. The sound of diesel engines would rumble from beyond a hill, Then the first shells would fall. He would peer through his periscope and see them, endless, advancing, unstoppable. In his field journal, he wrote one line that winter: "They build tanks faster than we can burn them." By the time the Soviet counteroffensive encircled Stalingrad, German officers had stopped asking where the tanks came from. They only asked how many were coming next. For the first time since 1939, the myth of German invincibility cracked, not because of strategy, but because of mathematics. Every destroyed T-34 was replaced by another, often before the wreck had frozen solid. Soviet crews, many barely trained, climbed into new machines as fast as they rolled off trains. The Germans realized too late that they were fighting not a single army, but a conveyor belt of war. And as the Red Army pushed westward, the T-34 became more than a weapon. It was a message, one stamped in steel and sent across the continent. You cannot outproduce us. You cannot outlast us. Muller, standing beside the smoking wreck of his panzer in the ruins near Voronezh, finally understood the truth his commanders had refused to see. The Soviets had not merely hidden factories. They had hidden an entire future, one that Germany could no longer catch. The tide had turned. The hunter had become the hunted. July 5, 1943. Western Russia. The plains outside Kursk shimmer beneath the early morning haze. Heat rises and ripples over fields scarred by tank tracks, mines, and burnt husks of steel. For weeks, both armies have stared at each other across this bulge in the front, the largest concentration of armor ever assembled in human history. Captain Karl-Heinz Müller leans against the turret of his new Panzer V Panther, the pride of German engineering. Sleek, powerful, designed in response to the Soviet menace. Around him, rows of Panzers idle, Tigers, Panzer IVs, the best machines Germany can produce. The men smoke in silence, waiting for the order to move. Above, Luftwaffe bombers drone eastward, their shadows sliding over the wheat. At 0500 hours, Operation Citadel begins. The ground shakes. Hundreds of tanks lurch forward in unison, grinding through minefields and barbed wire. Artillery opens fire, turning the horizon into flame. Muller grips his radio handset, shouting coordinates, eyes fixed on the distant tree line where the Red Army waits. The thunder of guns, the roar of engines, the crack of shells, all merge into one continuous storm. But the Germans are not advancing into weakness. They are charging into an industrial army that has learned, adapted, and multiplied. On the Soviet side, the earth itself seems to open. Rows of camouflaged T-34s emerge from dugouts and forests, their green hulls gleaming in the morning sun. Each tank crew moves with mechanical discipline. No panic, no chaos. When the German armor appears, they are ready. The first wave collides near Prokhorovka. The steppe becomes a furnace. Over 1,200 tanks engage across a killing ground barely 10 kilometers wide. Shells ricochet, engines explode, black smoke twists into the sky. Muller's Panther knocks out a T-34 at 200 meters, then another, before its turret jams from a glancing hit. He ducks as fragments slam against the hatch. To his right, a Tiger burns, its crew scrambling from the flames. Through the chaos, he glimpses the impossible. More T-34s cresting the ridge, their tracks glinting in sunlight. Then more, and more. They just keep coming. By midday, the Germans realize the nightmare has returned. No matter how many tanks they destroy, the Red Army's armor does not thin. Soviet field depots feed replacements into the line like ammunition, new tanks arriving by train, rolling directly into battle. The Wehrmacht's precision tactics drown under the sheer mass of metal. Muller's radio crackles with desperate chatter, reports of supply shortages, overheating engines, clogged guns. The T-34s move faster, turn quicker, survive longer. When German gunners find their mark, another wave fills the gap before the smoke clears. The horizon itself seems to crawl with the silhouettes of Soviet machines. At headquarters, General Heinz Guderian studies the incoming situation, reports with disbelief. The numbers make no sense. Soviet tank losses catastrophic, yes, but replacements already arriving. Intelligence had once claimed the USSR could not sustain a war of attrition. Yet here, in the crucible of Kursk, they are doing exactly that. 50,000 tanks, The number that once sounded like propaganda now feels horrifyingly real. By July 13th, Operation Citadel is over. German momentum dies on the steppe. Hitler calls off the offensive, the last great gamble of the Eastern Front. For the first time, Germany is forced onto the defensive, and the Red Army begins its relentless push westward. In the aftermath, Muller walks among the wreckage. Twisted metal, open hatches, scorched fields littered with the corpses of both armies. The air reeks of fuel and ash. He stops beside the charred hull of a T-34 and places a hand on its armor, still warm, impossibly thick for something built in such numbers. How? He whispers to no one. The answer lies thousands of kilometers away, in the roaring factories beyond the Urals, in the furnaces of Chelyabinsk, in the black lungs of workers who never saw the front but wanted all the same. The Soviets had turned production into a weapon, industry into a doctrine, labor into vengeance. The war that began with German precision and arrogance now belongs to Soviet steel and numbers. As Muller looks east, he sees columns of smoke rising on the horizon, not from destroyed tanks, but from new ones being born. The realization settles like a weight he will never shake. The Germans had lost the war the moment they underestimated what they could not see. The T-34 was no miracle. It was the proof of a nation's will, forged in fire, multiplied by 50,000. And now, nothing could stop it.